afternoon, everyone. We are here with this session, the policy making of first sustainable transition in Latin America. This session will explore the opportunities and challenges of design and implementing policies for a fair and sustainable transition in Latin America. The panel brings together a perspective from 3 different countries. We are waiting for Laura for the Brazilian case, but so far we'll be listening to the Colombia and Ecuador experiences. Our speakers here have a deep and long professional trajectories working with governments, civil society, and also in academia. So this is his insight or their insight will be quite useful for our discussions. First, I will present them, and after I will open the floor. On my right, my physical right, not the political one, we have Diego Guevara. Diego is associate professor at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, consultant for the French Development Agency on the macroeconomics and climate change, and visited professor at the European University Viandrina in Frankfurt, Germany. His research focuses on the financialization, post-Keynesian economics, and stock flow consistent macroeconomics model. He recently served as Minister of Finance, Colombia, under Gustavo Petro administration, and one of the central challenges of his tenure was advancing an economic policy aimed at inclusive productive diversification, while reducing the country dependence on oil extraction and exports. So first I will open the floor, and later I will introduce Daniel and Laura.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergio, Leonardo, Leo, for having me here, also to the Universidad Federal de Rio. I think that this panel suits very good for me, the policy making of a sustainable transition in Latin America. I had the chance to work with the Colombian government in the last 3 years, first as Deputy Minister BioCarbon, and then as Minister of Finance at the end of the last year and until April of this year. I think that the first idea that I would like to set up here is the fiscal challenge when you want to talk about fair, sustainable transitions in our countries. For the case of Colombia specific, our fiscal revenues depend between 15 and 20% from the oil and coal exports. And it's not easy to leave that from one to another. And when the President, Gustavo Petro, I just want to give a small example of the challenge that you face when you try to put this kind of policies. Gustavo Petro, 3 months after the election, he announced that he will stop the oil exploration, not exploitation. Exploitation is already going on, but just with this announce that he will stop the oil exploration immediately. We had a depreciation of 25% of the exchange rate and an increase of 5 points in the interest rate. And it was at the beginning of the government. And this is the pain of the international financial markets. I mean, everyone talks about the ESG, everyone about green transition, and probably from this first experience with Ocampo, we start to talk about, if we are going to talk about energy transition, we also need to talk about fiscal transition and export transition. I think that it's a first important message in the real life. All the different efforts that we can try to do from academia, talking about from fair, sustainable transition, needs also to talk about fiscal revenues, export transition, and how the markets take that. So I think that it's the first point that I really want to mention. And it connects with something that some people in the heterodox community, like Sebastián Valdecantos from Albert, he likes to talk about the green trilemma. And probably is that if you, when you are in a country or emerging economy, like the case of Colombia, fiscal revenue for social policy and for different efforts depends from the oil and gas exports. Definitely if I reduce to this kind of exports, I'm going to do social policy and I'm going to keep going with economic growth. So this is part of the fair transition. So when you have this green trilemma, you have the different dimension of export dimension in terms of your current account balance, you have the environmental dimension and the economic growth dimension. And probably you can have a good growth of the case that we had in the first decade of this century with the oil and gas boom in the golden age of the left Latin American politics, but it was pushed by the commodity boom. But when we don't have a commodity boom, how we're going to finance all the different social policy, and now how we're going to finance the energy transition. So this is an important part to take into account when we talk about the green trilemma, because probably for us an emerging economy, the problem is not the energy transition itself, it's the macroeconomic vulnerabilities to the transition to low carbon economy. And it's a topic that we have been working recently together, start to understand, for us as emerging countries, which are the main vulnerabilities that we can face if the rest of the world, if our exports in terms of oil and coal start to decrease. And it's something that it's going to happen. Probably these are the kind of left. You have here the position of Lula that I'm going to keep going with oil, but Petro's position was a bit more radical. But the markets, the market pain and the market consequences in terms of interest rate and exchange rate, it's something that we're facing today. So probably this is an important point because it's immediately increase or can increase your fiscal deficit if you don't do a carefully transition in all the different fronts. Probably you can have also problems in terms of your public debt, even the country risk. Immediately when the President Petro started to present the idea to decrease the exports of oil and gas, immediately the rating agencies start to change the grade of qualification. And when you go to Wall Street, I had the chance to go a couple of times to Wall Street, to go to all the big funds, BlackRock, all the different Goldman Sachs boys. They don't care nothing about energy transition of our country. They keep in the idea, which is your fiscal balance, and I want the correct signal that you are going to pay. And it was not 10 years ago, no, it was the last year. And probably it's the same reaction from the rating agencies. For example, another experience that we have had in this government, the green fiscal rules, trying to open the discussion that probably we need a more fiscal space for green investment. We tried to work with Manuel Martinez, who was my advisor and who unfortunately passed away here in Rio the last year. And Manuel was working a lot in the green fiscal rule. We present a project to the parliament for the green fiscal rule, trying to exclude the green investment from the fiscal balance, and immediately the reaction of the market, of the policy makers, even for the reaction from my friend Jose Antonio Campo was expenditure is expenditure. It doesn't matter if it's green, red, blue. And we try to position this topic of the green fiscal rule because with the current fiscal rules in the world, it's impossible that we achieve all the different agreements from the Paris 15. I think that it's something, and this is part of the debate. I think that an important part of the debate, not just for Colombia, but most of the emerging countries, we need fiscal rules that are consistent with the energy transition and with all the different NDC agreement that we're trying to have. And it's something that probably is going to be the discussion. So when we talk about fair transition, and I insist, it's important to talk about the fiscal fraud. Because in the globalized and financial world, probably the main signal that the financial markets are waiting is your fiscal balance. When you go to Wall Street and you talk about public education, okay, amazing, you want to do green bond, but I just want to see primary balance and liability payments, and is that how you are going to achieve all the different commitments that we have with different investment funds. So basically what I feel is that there is a lot of hypocrisy in this Wall Street world. Somebody yesterday mentioned the idea of Daniela Gabor, and it was Luis, I'm not sure, of the Wall Street consensus. And I think that today, despite we're talking about energy transition and finance and sustainability finance, probably in the financialized world, still the main issue is the return of the different investments despite of the green investment. So this is probably another challenge that you have. And finally, I think that just to talk about some restriction, we have also legal restriction in terms of the laws of our country. I don't know how it's here, but for the case of Colombia, the fiscal rule is at constitutional level. At a constitutional level. So if you don't achieve the fiscal rule, or you want to try to find different ways to escape to the fiscal rule and have more space for green investment, immediately you are broken a law and you're having a legal problem. Now I have a legal problem in Colombia because we try to find different ways to escape of to the fiscal constraint. So basically it's a problem, and I think that part of the discussion in our region is to try again to push the idea of the green fiscal rule, because in the globalized world it's important to send a message of fiscal sustainability. Of course, in the academia we love to talk about Ava Lerner or functional finance, and I deeply believe in that in terms of the theoretical framework. But when you go to find money for try to maintain your current account balance, immediately still the surplus in your primary balance is like the main thing. So those are some of the restrictions. And when you go to the phase of the policy making, when you start to talk about all these ideas of debt swap, of the debt for climate action, the President Gustavo Petro, in all the different international scenarios, he goes debt relief for climate action. But anyone in Wall Street, any one of the bond holders, give to you some message of some hope that they are ready to implement some debt relief. Immediately what appears are all the investment banks trying to find complex derivative for the special swaps of the Ecuador that probably he will tell later, and they try to sell you, look what we did in Ecuador, or look, in Uruguay we did a special SLB, the sustainable linked bonds, and they try to present this as the future of the sustainable finance, but basically it's more financialization where they try to find the commission to structure the product. So when I was in the government, I went to Geneva, I went to Frankfurt, and immediately, hey Diego, Minister, I have heard that the President is interested in debt for nature. Yes, debt for nature relief. No, it's not relief. We want to offer new financial products. So probably what is happening now is that with all the green energy transition and green transition discourse, the financial market is also creating new products that the main concern, unfortunately, is not a fair transition, it's just keeping revenues for the international market. So it's also something that I want to mention in this scenario of the different challenges that you have when you try to do fair, sustainable transition in Latin America. When I try to present this scenario to the young people or so, probably the people say, okay, then what we can do? And the space for real action, unfortunately, is not a big space, but still we can try to work in different aspects as heterodox scholars. And some examples of things that we can try to move forward. For example, in all the different Keynesian literature, today the stock flow consistent models are models that are being used in different places, in the Central Bank of England, in the French Development Agency, actually in the Finance Minister of Colombia, the chance that we had to be there, we had the chance to implement the GEMS model, that is a stock flow model, demand-oriented model, to try to discuss all the different alternatives from the heterodox perspective for the sustainable transition. So I think that it's small, but it's an important conquer and something that we can try to do. How we can use our tools or the heterodox tools that are not the standard ESG macroeconomic model, trying to use more heterodox macroeconomic models to discuss this idea of, for example, what we did. And we did with Leonardo actually some chapters and implement the model in finance minister, which is the best way, for example, in terms of finance the transition, mixing between multilateral and private, or mixing forms of financing. I think that it's something that we can try to introduce, the heterodox models for policy making. I think that it's something important to, in terms when you present a project to the parliament, the idea of the green fiscal rule that I was talking before. When we introduce that, we try to do all the modelization and all the simulation using heterodox models. So it's something that I think that also makes sense. But definitely, and I think that the idea of the policy making of the first sustainable transition is also something that we need to work together as a region. For example, the free trade agreement of Colombia and Peru, they negotiated the free trade agreement with the United States together 15 years ago. And probably a lot of the negotiation, and I think that this idea that we have the next week in Bogota, the Amazonia Region Presidents Summit, it's important to try to go together and push together as a region for different policies. As an individual country, it's not easy to do the fight against the international market, against the international bond holders. But I think that we try to go together as Amazonic countries, as Latin American countries, probably the discussion of new financial architecture and energy transition is going to be the future. Definitely, we cannot talk about first sustainable transition if we don't talk about new financial architecture. And I think that, and with this important message, I want to close. We cannot talk about first sustainable transition in emerging countries without the discussion of new financial architecture. Why? Because for the current financial architecture, the main message is fiscal sustainability. And if we keep moving in the standard framework of the fiscal sustainability, if the standard fiscal rules, if the sound finance, the space of resources that we need for a real energy and green transition is not going to happen. And the green transition is going to be just a mess. So basically, I want to close with this message. When we talk about first sustainable transition, we need also to talk about the new international financial architecture. It's not something that we can work new financial architecture in one hand, and we can work the green energy transition or the fair transition in the other hand. Those two topics needs to be worked together. So it's a financial transition also in the world, in the world architecture. But because right now still we keep talking about sustainable transition in the region, and we have different proposals. But when you have the measures of the Wall Street and the measure of the rating agency, finally they just keep looking to the primary balance surplus in your primary balance, and that you need to achieve the fiscal rules. So basically, I think that is something where we should try to move forward. That's 20 minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So let's continue with on my right also, not on my ideological part. Daniel Ortega Pacheco. Daniel is director of BioCarbon, a consultancy specialized in sustainability, climate finance, and carbon market. He served as Ecuador Minister of Environment, Water, and Ecological Transition in the period between 2015 and 2017. Almost 10 years ago, where he contributed to innovative environmental policies, including constitutional recognition of right of nature and Chasuni initiative, He has contributed to international processes as the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and the International Capital Market Association Green Bond Principles. Daniel brings a unique perspective bridging government, multilateral, and private sector efforts to design and implement policies for a fair and sustainable transition. So, Daniel, you got the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio, and of course, thank you for the organizers. It's always a challenge to have these discussions after lunch, but please bear with me. I'm going to try to make it as enthusiastic as possible. Second, to mention that now that you made the case, I was a young scholar when I was minister, not any longer. We realized that with Carola, but it has been wonderful to hear what you're doing, what you want to achieve in your research, and that's really motivating. Please keep doing it. I don't want to repeat what we heard yesterday, right? There's a climate emergency. The region is facing the different traps, poverty, inequality, the one of fiscal space that Diego has now emphasized, and I think what Diego also shared with us is the real politic, right? And so please keep those in your mind as I made my presentation, because ECO is essentially the same thing, right? And even larger dependency on oil extraction, 60% of total income of the country goes through oil exploitation. So every time that you touch upon transition and different alternative models and how can you finance that, the same discussions will come around in a ministerial roundtable, but also with civil society. We need to continue working with civil society so they understand the urgency, the alternatives, and they support it, because otherwise these are theoretical concepts and ideas, whether novel or not, but they don't have the political push to go through. So how we can overcome those through the network that we are trying to set up is of particular importance. So having said that, my reflections to you will be grounded in experience during my term as public servant, both in ECO and at the global level, but also in regional collaboration with civil society, post-government. And I think that at this point of time, the most urgent question isn't just how we finance the transition or how much is needed, but for whom and whose term. I remember yesterday from the conversation with our colleague from Oxfam, he was emphatic to say that even transitions in the material near term will have to depend on extractive industries, and those will come to a cost with communities living in the Amazonian. So we need to really define what is the green pact means for us in each of our countries. And perhaps the truth and knowledge that we have will inform those decisions. But at this point, there is no breaking down the current development model. The only thing that we are discussing is how to find the transition, but not the modeling itself. Perhaps Brazil is going into the first steps to discuss bioeconomy and others, and may provide some examples for the region, but it's still on diapers, I would say, the overall debate in the region. So keeping this in mind, also let's understand that perhaps Latin America has been the source for some institutional innovations that I will share with you, at least the case of Ecuador. One of them is the rights of nature. This is not the result of my work, but it's a social accumulation. The rights of nature reflected in the Ecuadorian Constitution, it's a long-standing battle of civil society, particularly the indigenous movement, to have this reflected, because that's the way they live, right? It's a way of living. So recognizing the rights of nature, it is in the Constitution, it is a constitutional rule, but our challenge is different from the one in Colombia. You need to surpass the constitutional rule. Here is to make it effective, because nature will not protect itself. The citizens need to stand up and represent in judiciary terms nature, and that has not yet been streamlined. The second thing is when earlier today we discussed stranded assets and potential ways to finance hard-to-abate sectors, let's say coal, mining, and so on. They need to transition as well in order to secure the job employment level and so on. We created the Yasuni initiative. Again, this was not my doing. I joined as an advisor, but the Yasuni initiative in itself was no other thing than a financial model. We wanted to take nature assets and we wanted to mobilize international flow so that we can transition from oil extraction. We offered the world not to extract the oil on the ground, 30% of total oil reserves, in exchange of payments. It didn't work, despite the fact that we pursued negotiations for over 5 years. As you find it with different investment funds, we find it with governments. Governments will tell you we are all about climate change, but when you ask them to pay under the principles of the convention, then things are different. They will tell you we will not pay for doing nothing. Right? So not extracting oil represents not doing the action. We understand the economic value of that and the social cost that is avoided. When you extract, you have an overall social cost, not only because of carbon, but all the other externalities. So I take that as the initiative perhaps was too early for our current times, but it was a model that serves to value biodiversity in different terms that only given a price. Two, that also enable us to plan a transition to different industry, not extractive ones, because it promotes sustainable tourism and the others. But at the end of the day, introduce also carbon pricing mechanism. The way that we understood the value of those reserves and to get the net present value, we used two different models. One was the value of the oil at the time, and also the value of carbon. So even though the price signal is still not correct, it at least was useful to derive a value that we could ask in exchange. Third experience has to do with bioeconomy. In 2016, we finalized a national strategy for biodiversity. It was very early on, but we already introduced specific objectives and indicators to deploy bioeconomy. And bioeconomy understood also perhaps in the same terms that Colombia is understanding bioeconomy. It's a high-tech innovation in the use of biodiversity, genetic resources, and others, so that we can promote different types of industrial development. And that was introduced. At this point in time, I would say it was a very engaging process, but it remains to be challenged. Once you go out of the government, what the next government will do will not necessarily continue those transition models if it doesn't work for the balance sheet and every other thing. Right now, Ecuador, I would say it has great challenges in extracting the oil. We are not even good doing what we used to do. Now we are importing oil derivatives, and our fiscal space has been reduced because now by the time that we import this, we pay Colombia for energy now and Peru. Now we don't have income sources, and what we are receiving as loans, we're having to use to pay the interest of the standing loans. So that's what these three experiences perhaps would tell you the putting into play of rights framework, right? Rights to nature, rights to people, and the right to development of future generations, and also the right to biodiversity to serve the purpose without being extracted, undermined, or eroded. Let me now, with that, move into the experience post-public service. One, you remain to be responsible to what you did. So you need to continue doing oversight on the things that you wanted to introduce. Perhaps you will follow up on the models that you have introduced and continue that public debate. So that extended responsibility, to me, it was translated in three different ways. The first one is that we helped, I joined the academia after government. I returned, I never left academia, but I returned to academia, and we helped to set up the Sustainable Finance Initiative in the country, right? And from the exercise and the real politics of government, we understood that we needed to talk to private sector. So this Sustainable Finance Initiative was set up with the banks, the private banks, the public banks, the regulatory authorities, the central bank, the supervisory authorities also for banks, and international organizations. And at the end of the day, what it helped us to do is incubate capacity building programs. And we helped train 95% of the national banking assets to understand what it means sustainable finance, how to issue green bonds with integrity, and it worked. So if the network that we are setting up aims to have capacity building on a more progressive perspective, I think we can make it. We can make it happen. The second experience I will share, perhaps it was closely developed with Carola and Latin that it has to do with the oversight that we did on the debt for nature swap that Ecuador did with Galapagos, right? That right now is positioned as a poster child example of what these innovative instruments can do, but we challenge that hypothesis because it has not been proven. In the governance component, we don't know whether this is a necessary sufficient arrangement that will provide for long-term sustainability to the management of natural resources. It's still an idea, right? If the financial process work out, not necessarily for the country because the debt relief was small and the clauses in case of default are a significant risk. And when it is discussed, the idea of de-risking these private investments essentially is a risk. We understand risk never disappears, right? It's only transfer. Now it's transfer against the government. So the government takes all the responsibility so that this could work for private. And then you start asking yourself, is really this a state-led type of financing for development, or is actually the other way around? These are standards being developed by private sector that now are imposing governments if you want to access the finance that you need. But there are definitely areas for improvement. So those lessons and risks under debt swap includes conditionality imposed by the external actors. What it means is that now the government does not manage the Galapagos Island directly. Even the fund that has been set up now provides funding to public actors to do what they have to do. So we don't understand the resource dependency theory. You understand that when you lose administrative authority and budgetary authority, you lose control. And we will have to see whether this new governance structure will serve the purpose in the long term and will keep the balance that usually we as policymakers have to deal with, right? We need to balance that out, the trade-off between different interests so that we can serve the public purpose. We do not know whether this new governance structure will be able to do that on the ground. Keeping in mind time, the debt swaps provided this conditionality imposed by external actors, lack of participatory governance, and minimal fiscal relief relative to overall debt levels. And the way that we are proposing to move forward is let's leave swaps as the last resort. Let's look for debt relief whenever there are justified issues of that debt. The second, of course, I associate that with a new financial architecture. But if you decide to pursue a debt swap, let's try to do it on a high integrity basis. And we put forward a proposal for principles, what this high integrity means, right? What is the transparency that should be associated, the engagement and the civil society participation throughout the process, and the third is how you would safeguard, not only for communities and for the environment, but we need to introduce elements for safeguards for governments, right? How can we avoid that the risk is transferred back to governments? Because the financial benefit is not on us. So why you transfer both the risks, the costs, and the loss of overall authority on the management of resources if you are not deriving any benefits? What we wrote together last year with Professor Mariana Mazzucato and others was that the distribution of risk and benefits should be oversight and they should be safeguarded to make this equally balanced. So lastly, the last initiative that we have included in the last few years with the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation and Agriculture was to understand that, okay, there is an issue of risk, but let us work on de-risking, not risk transferring alone. And perhaps one of the best alternatives to de-risk investments in sectors that already have a very challenging risk profile, risk return profile like agriculture will be capacity building. So we have set up a partnership for capacity building for agricultural carbon. We will be training government officials on how to set up these enabling environments. We will train farmers on how they can make sure that their rights are not disrupted in terms of land management, in terms of human rights and safeguards. And this is a ministerial mandated platform. So we tested a different approach, right? Usually we set up a network, a platform, and then we knock the door of the government, and sometimes they don't listen. So this time around, we tested something different. Ministers of Agriculture, they decided that they needed a capacity building platform, and that has helped us mobilize resources. We have set up a donor advice fund and a technical assistance facility, learning to what it seems to work in the mainstream, but simply taking the same structure to work for other intentions. On this platform, of course, it helps you also understand that carbon markets may need improvement. And so we are doing research in the rethinking of the carbon markets from a South perspective. What is that needs to happen? Understanding that carbon markets are not a silver bullet. They will not solve the climate problem in itself, but they may serve to mobilize finance that otherwise would not occur to accelerate climate action. Using credits for offsetting is completely out of the picture, but whether the carbon credit can act as an asset that we can manage in support of the transition is something that we are looking at very closely. I have circulated a draft paper to Sergio and the other colleagues. If any of you is interested, please take a look at whether this means a research agenda that we can jointly explore. We will definitely be pursuing this in depth as the issues of price discovery in environmental assets has not been researched even for mainstream economics. And if there are issues of price discovery in regular financial assets, on carbon markets even larger. So research, understanding, and recommendations in that area is of particular importance. So having said this, let me close by saying that there should be hope. Unfortunately, yesterday night, I took with me perhaps a not so positive thing. But I think that for young researchers and for all of us that are working in this area, what we are doing with the network, having this workshop, setting up our own agenda already gives you that there is a space for improvement, keeping in mind that there are reality checks, that there is a real politique that we need to confront. That has always been the case for any progressive reform. In any other front, in social areas, in rights, now the economic care, it's all the same. And we have never been afraid of it. And the region has been, most of the time, a laboratory test for this improvement. So if we have in the region, we have the rights of nature. If in the region we have attested something like the Yasuni initiative, in the region we have one of the strongest heterodox working groups, I think there is something that we can do. And perhaps Brazil and what the COP offers is just an opportunity for us to restate that something can happen, and if we put together standards, tools, and innovative instruments that we can also mainstream on the principles that we agreed on to solve the problem, I think there is space for us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Daniel, you have been amazing with time, so thank you very much for that. Now we have Laura Carvalho from Brazil. Laura is Director of Economics and Climate Prosperity at the Open Society Foundation, and Professor at the Universidade de São Paulo, USP, in Brazil. In her philanthropic work, she has focused on the climate transition and as an opportunity for economic and social development. And she's also a member of the Council for Economic, Social, and Sustainable Development, created under Lula's administration to institutionalize this dialogue between government and civil society. So, Laura,
thank you very much. I have no slides.
Yes.
So you pass them? Yeah? Or
Yeah.
is there
No. We have no, so don't worry.
Thank you, and apologies for being late. So I'll try to focus, before starting on Brazil, I know we have kind of country roles in this panel, and I'll try to talk about Brazil in the end, but I'll also start a little bit more with the context that I think other developing countries are facing in terms of seizing opportunities that the climate transition offers for development, and in particular for economic, structural economic transformation. Please, just go to the end of it. Yeah, exactly. You don't need to do it, you're ready. So, of course, I think when we talk about just transitions, people are mostly thinking about the costs of the transition, and I want to focus instead on the benefits or the potential benefits, economically and socially. And of course, I mean, this is not new. We live in a world in which several countries are somewhat trying to look at the climate transition together with questions of national security and sovereignty and structure new industrial policies that try to take into account these different objectives and deliver on both climate, jobs, economic growth. We, in particular, have countries deploying what we came to call green industrial policy or green industrial strategies. They vary a lot. But of course, the most prominent example is China, with Made in China 2025, that really became dominant in most of the green technologies that the world uses today for their own energy transition and climate transition. We, of course, have the US during Biden's administration with the IRA, I'll get back to that. And other countries, Germany, South Korea, India, are including somewhat and trying to integrate climate goals with socio-economic development goals. Please. This creates opportunities in the following sense. Of course, this means industrial policy is no longer a bad word, right? We have this return of industrial policy in the conversation. We can measure this in different ways. There are new databases that are consolidating the use of different industrial policy tools. What we can say is that many of these new industrial policies are connected to climate and climate mitigation in particular. That's the red portion of this chart here of new industrial policies stated by objectives, right? So we have, of course, national security is also appearing on the dark blue here. But in terms of stated objective doesn't necessarily mean the actual objective. We know the IRA, for example, is probably climate as stated objective, but geopolitical and national security reasons for the actual objectives. But in any case, this shows that there is a surge. And when it comes to emerging markets and developing economies, we don't see, most of this surge is coming elsewhere. So the blue line there is the new industrial policy announcements, the total ones, including rich and advanced economies. The red line is the red dotted line is the only emerging markets, and so we see that, of course, that surge is not necessarily translating into more industrial policy in the global south. Please move to the next. This means that there is in terms of in particular, different green technologies or clean technologies, only a few countries are benefiting so far from this climate transition and are really benefiting in the sense of exporting the technologies that we have. So if you look at the distribution, you see that high-income countries dominate around from 74 to 87% of all green industrial policies across solar, wind, EV, battery, etc. That's not including China, which dominates the rest, right? It's country. So we are in a world that reproduces what I shouldn't have to explain in this university or even for this audience, the very old trade patterns in which, when it comes to the climate transition, we have again some countries, of course, with China being the new element there, but a few countries that are really exporting the technologies, in this case, the green, clean technologies, and in the best case scenario for countries in the global south, they are exporting the raw materials that are needed for these clean technologies. In other words, the critical minerals or the transition minerals, as some are calling it. Global South is really dominant in those resources, and they dominate the production of these minerals. There are some examples there. For example, DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, dominates 72% of cobalt. Indonesia, 38% of nickel. Chile, 26% of lithium. So not only these countries export these minerals, but also you have single countries with a very large share of available critical minerals, and that are really recreating an extractive economy around the production, the extraction of these minerals. When in fact China is the one processing the minerals and adding value to that. I'll continue in the next slide. Please just move that one, I won't have time. This creates the following context, I think, for what we want to talk about here, or at least what I want to frame, which is the opportunity side of this. So on the one hand, of course, the decline of neoliberalism in the north and the resurgence of industrial policy with climate as one strong, important dimension of this surge opens up policy space. So this panel here is about policy making. There is more policy space. When we say policy space, we mean really the narratives and the dominant narratives that frame the role of the state as shaping structural transformation, I think is more favorable now with the rich countries doing it than it was in the past, right? So we do have some more policy space for active state-led strategies. In particular, the climate transition itself, even without considering the economic development objectives, by itself, the climate transition requires many things that a development strategy requires in terms of what is needed for success. So the climate transition is really about long-term planning. Everyone who's in the climate conversation is going to be talking about 2050, 2030 at least, right? Every target is long-term. The problem is only solvable in the long term. And so it rescues something that has been lost in the economic discussions for so long, which is the need to plan. And it's not just the need to look at that longer-term horizon, but it's also the need to transform economies very structurally and embody new technologies that create that possibility in the long term. And so we're talking structural change, right? And structural change is exactly what economic development strategies are about. And finally, I think in the climate conversation, it's very clear, even though there is so much conversation about climate finance and new instruments and what the private sector can do, I don't think there's anyone these days who at least is serious about the climate problems that doesn't put the state into the core of what needs to be done. It's the only agent that can really coordinate a strategy for a transition. And so again, we need state capacity, we need several tools, we need coordination of states, which means that everything that the climate transition really requires to be successful is also what a national development strategy requires to be successful. And this is an opportunity in itself, because as we think about structuring a strategy around the climate transition, we are somewhat recovering what the Washington Consensus has destroyed for decades in terms of the capacity of countries to develop. Please. Here, though, based on this opportunity, I think one issue that we have is that while the climate transition maybe does have differences between countries, depending on whether the source of the emissions is one type of energy, whether it's land use, and so of course in the energy transition itself, you require different things to be done, but definitely when it comes to seizing economic benefits, then really there is no one-size-fits-all solution. There is no way every country will benefit in the exact same way, because there's even a problem of coordination here. It's not that every country will have the opportunity to process the same minerals. Even the available resources are different, but also the pieces of the supply chain that could be grabbed are very different. They depend on existing capabilities, on existing technologies. And so there is a very important task in each country context in the developing world for policy making to really assess not only what existing capabilities are that will allow you to seize those opportunities and structure your development strategy in a way that integrates climate, jobs, inequality reduction, growth, and other goals, but also looking at what the rest of the world is doing. Because your strategy will only succeed if somehow your advantage is better than someone else's, or if you coordinate with someone else. And that's where I think the South-South cooperation becomes so important in this context. So I'll just give an example here to start the conversation about concrete stories. Indonesia has a story with nickel that I don't know how much everyone is familiar here. But Indonesia basically, and it's a story of both success and failure. I will mention the success side here, but there are other dimensions of what's being done in the nickel strategy that including environmental and labor rights issues that have been very much contested. But I want to focus on the opportunity seized, right? So in an environment where the WTO is being basically not functioning, and that's not just the new Trump administration. This was also true in the first Trump administration, and then continued under Biden. That the U.S. has abandoned has nominated the appelling body of the WTO, and so this means that the WTO has lost the capacity of punishing governments around the world that do not follow trade rules, right? Of course, there are double standards still, but the fact is that Indonesia did something, which was to ban the export of nickel, plus some other that they had. They established a ban in exports to make sure that the gains of nickel were internalized and that there would be value added in the country on the nickel value chain. And so they banned the exports. This was punished by the WTO. So there was a decision that they couldn't do it, but because the WTO is not able to enforce anymore, they continued to do it. And by doing that, they really upgraded a lot in the value chain. It's not that they're producing batteries, but they were able to move some steps in the value chain of nickel, and the export value was really much higher. I don't know if I have the number here, but I've heard like it tripled. And it wasn't a price issue, it was really a content issue, and how they created a technological shift. This was done with Chinese companies. It's not that they were Indonesian companies, but the Chinese companies had to come into Indonesia to process the nickel. And this already creates a level of technology transfer that is completely different than what other producers have, right? So in this sense, it's a success story. There are problems with environmental impact and social and labor impacts of the presence of these Chinese companies in Indonesia. So of course, this needs to come together with a broader strategy of how this will happen, but I think it provides with a good case of a country that has natural resources and was able to do more than just export the commodity. Here it is, what I said. So nickel exports jumped from 4.5 to 19.6 billion from 2019 to 2022 only, after establishing the export ban. Yeah, please. Another example, Mexico. Here, it's less of an example of a country that already managed to succeed, and it's a country that is trying to, that has a new strategy for that, and that is very different from that of Indonesia. So Mexico has its own strength. They're different. It has, of course, a very, it's the largest manufacturing base in the continent, right? Although it has a strong dependence on the US. But it's now seizing opportunities on electric vehicles, batteries, and components. It's deeply integrated in North American supply chains and the US, and so of course it's now facing a lot of risks because of the way tariffs are affecting that, but it has a lot of new EV investments across projects. It also has some advantages on electrolyzers and hydrogen technologies, solar, some components of wind power, and so it has its own sectors where Plan Mexico that they're adopting is trying to focus on and strengthen through different initiatives. Please. You can just skip the Mexico piece, and I'll come finally to Brazil. Here it's a report actually by, and so I'm not an engineer. I'm not an engineer, which means it's very hard when it comes to the no one size fits all solution. I think it requires the type of identifying the opportunities requires some kind of technical analysis of these supply chains that we often lack as economists. And so the first thing to look at the strategies that we need to be very humble about. And I'm not saying these are necessarily the sectors where Brazil has the largest opportunities, but this is a report by the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab by Johns Hopkins, where they look at Brazil, but they also look at other countries and the different dynamics. And the choices so far, and this is what New Industry Brazil is already doing. It's not a normative statement here, but what it's doing is that it's positioning in sustainable aviation fuels, and there are two different technologies for that. There is an organic technology, there is an inorganic technology for SAF. Brazil is investing in both. The organic technology is actually less carbon neutral. It's more carbon intensive than the inorganic. But the northeast of Brazil has been through the green hydrogen projects. There's a lot of projects on SAF. Most of them ethanol based, which is not the cleanest possibilities. Then EVs and batteries, of course, they're trying to attract EVs. That's what they're doing. There's new Chinese plants being developed. Some think that through the green hydrogen, also green steel would be an opportunity. And so the fact that there is some advantages for green hydrogen, there is green steel. Then we have other things that already were in the structure before, like wind turbines. But just to give an example that each country will have their strategy, their sectors, but there is an intention to try to integrate the industrial policy with climate also in the region. That's fine. That's fine. These examples bring something that I think is important for policymaking in the region and in the South more generally, which is the possibility of coordinated industrial policies. Of course, there is already, it's hard. China is dominant in most technologies. The US and Europe continue, the US has now abandoned the race, which makes things easier for us. At least there are some things that are up for grabs, since the Trump administration has basically eliminated every single green subsidy of the IRA. But still, China is dominant, Europe is investing a lot, and so it's hard to do by yourself. When it comes to innovation in particular, it's very hard. And so there has been some efforts to try to think of industrial policy, and particularly green industrial policy, as a coordinated effort. In the case of Brazil and Mexico, there has been conversations about trade and investment agreements that explore a certain complementarities and synergies in electromobility, in energy, in semiconductors, and in agribusiness. And I think no matter whether this particular solution works or doesn't, I think the type of strategies that try to coordinate what different countries are doing, I think can have a higher chance of succeeding. Now to the challenges for policy making. I think opportunities I think they exist. They have been identified. Maybe there's still controversy around some of them in these countries. But of course, we need the right tools in place. And when it comes to policy making, ambitious agendas like this that integrate climate, social, and economic development goals, they require multiple tools as well, and strong coordination across ministries. These are not agendas anymore that are Ministry of Environment. These are not agendas that can be done in this approach that we had in the past that constrain adaptation and mitigation together with environmental and biodiversity goals within the Ministry of Environment. This can only be done through coordination across ministries. It's about what the Ministry of Energy, it's about the Ministry of Development and Trade, it's about the Ministry of Finance and the policy tools, procurement, it's about the national development banks and the development finance institutions, no matter what they are in a context. It's about the state-owned enterprises and what they can do. In the case of Brazil, clearly Petrobras has a role, a very powerful role in this transition. And so I think that coordination is something that is usually missing, even in the context where we have identified opportunities where governments already have policies that are looking at these opportunities. We don't see that coordination. We don't see that ambition of integrating the different aspects into a same ambitious agenda. And so these are the different tools that I think we need, and that's just, it's not exhaustive, but just a list of tools that can and need to be used for these types of elements. Then the second, I think, big challenge, the fiscal capacity, of course, right? So if we compare what these countries in the north that are deploying industrial policies have, and what the countries, the developing economies have in terms of tools, right? So if you look at the tools, of course the North is using very different kinds of tools because many of these tools are expensive and other tools are not expensive. So tariffs, for example, they raise resources, right? In the case of fiscal subsidies, it's very budgetary, has strong budgetary implications. And so what we see is that the group of countries in the rich economies, they're using much more diversity of tools in achieving these industrial policies than the countries in the south because they face fiscal constraints and therefore their capacity to deliver on these multiple goals is much lower, right? I think the next one. Yeah, you know what? I think I'm at time, or I don't have a couple of minutes. Because I could close. So why don't I close with more general? You can just ignore the slides because I don't want to focus that much on climate finance, which I know there are people who have been talking about here much more. I think, of course, there are changes also in the global governance that need to happen, both on finance and on the trade architecture to create an enabling environment for this. But on the policy-making side, I think in terms of the integration or the coordination, it's something that only depends on countries themselves, right? Of course, state capacity is something that is hard to build, but it's not necessarily, I mean, the lack of resources that you have only make it more important to utilize these resources in a much more coordinated way. And in the case of Brazil, so to end back in the Brazil context, even though there is an identification of strategic factors within the new industry plan, within the ecological transformation plan, within the new PAC, namely the infrastructure plan. There are sustainability aspects in all of that. There is a bioeconomy strategy. There's lots of different programs within the government that have tried to compatibilize in less or more effective ways climate and economic goals. However, there is some kind of Darwinistic approach to public policy in which you just see 100 different things happening at the same time to see what will prosper, right? And that's the approach that the Brazilian government is having right now. They have policies in every ministry that have something interesting in them, and it's almost like taking an evolutionary approach to it, in which maybe out of this something will work.
It's true that we survive.
And really, I mean, that's of course for political reasons too. I don't want to get into the political and succession elements of this. But the reality is that I think one thing we can say with these policies is that there is no evolutionary approach to this type of policies that can succeed, because for the policies to succeed, you need to take a big bet on them and have an ambition and have an integration and have a coordination that cannot, so there is no way any of these policies will really deliver on putting Brazil as like a green economic power if there is no backing with resources, with political capital, with narratives, with everything, with the different tools, the policies themselves. And so the only way policymaking will succeed in setting an ambitious sustainable development agenda that really puts the country in the global value chains, and I'm not just talking about transitioning, but transitioning with industrial technological development. There is no way you can do that by just having a multiplicity of policies that do not integrate. The only way to succeed is to have an ambitious structural transformation plan and have all the tools, especially given that you have fiscal constraints. Like if you didn't have any fiscal constraints, maybe you could have 100 things at scale. But the way we are constrained by fiscal rules, you need to have a bet and a direction and all the tools working around that bet and that direction. And I think that may be the element that is in, I would say, in the sphere of control of the country, right? Because there are so many other things that are outside the sphere of control and that creates the asymmetries in global governance. Of course, we can continue as countries in the South to act in multilateral space and push for reform and advocate. But in terms of what can be done by policy making, I think that integration and that ambition is really what's needed, plus the coordination with other countries in the region or even outside the region to make sure that it's not a zero-sum game that we are aiming for. Thank you.
Diego, Daniel, can you come back for the question? Or please don't escape for the question.
Not running away.
So, well, I will start with the left. Nicolas, Carlos Eduardo, Jonathan, Pedro, Luis Fernando, okay, and Orlando, the first round, okay. Nicolas.
Well, I'm Nicolas, I'm a researcher at the European University Institute, and I have a question probably more for the Economia. And the question is, yesterday we heard a lot about de-risking in a very critical way. And my question is, I think especially the talk of Sergio was a bit less skeptical of de-risking, and I see the point, and I also think that sometimes we may be overcritical of de-risking because I see some role for de-risking private investment, especially in the case of green technologies, because this is something that has been discussed since always. So the BNDES for technological investments has always been guarantee private sector investment and so on. So this is kind of a standard tool. And so I would like to hear you a bit more about this de-risking approach and where do you see it problematic and what kind of problems it can actually help to solve?
Carlos Eduardo?
I'm Carlos Eduardo, more known as Captain. I'm a professor here. And yeah, you said that once upon a time I was young at school. I went go to school. I covered this very good in March 1983. I never left this building. So, what have your experience? This is something that I have to say. I am not a decision maker. I am not someone who does anything else than, teach these guys here and watch and see. But we have a role. I don't want to be rude with you. I know that you are at the top of the class, particularly what you are doing. But it's the role of the account to make questions. First of all, someone that comes from the environmental, we are exhausted. Estamos muy cansados. Because we had this very same talk, Rio plus 20. I've never heard this thing. Have you ever heard there was the mention of Rio plus 20 here in 2008? No, actually, I haven't heard about Canal COP last year in Colombia, which was possibly the most strategic one before the one we have. So I think that we need to address real issues. General, nice ideas and thoughts. We have been with so many for so long that we're getting exhausted. But going into real, what is sustainable transition? Please put in specific thing. Is it sustainable energy? Laura, all the examples you give, you are talking about sustainable energy. Brazil and Latin America has more than 100 years of sustainable energy. Brazilian code, we'll discuss this next week. Brazilian code, 1934 to 25, is about hydropower. We had ethanol problem 50 years ago, and it did not change anything, either in fair or sustainable terms. We need to address real issues. Real issues have to do with land use, deforestation. And that's my question. Is the issue of subsidized rural credit being raised in this event? We are still subsidizing rural operations that lead to deforestation. We are just about to launch, maybe in September, research on that. We are still financing deforestation. This is the most single important issue that Latin America has to contribute. Everything else is peanuts compared to deforestation. And deforestation is not only an issue of losing trees or animals. It's about murder, violence. It is an extremely violent project. There is a huge development project. We call it the Pacific Road. In September, I'm going to Cruzeiro do Sul, in Peru. It's financed by financial institutions. The very same that has this wonderful propaganda on TV, on how green we are getting, if we are as green as people, and especially the sustainable, everything else has been sustainable in before. The sustainable finance sector, who is doing it? There is a very important connection with the finance sector for all the predatory issues that I would like to hear. From Daniel, I would like to hear specifically because of the SME experience. What do you think about the oil extraction in Amapá? I suppose that you are, if you're not okay, but if you heard of the idea, which is the most important development project of this moment, not the one, the most important development program in the Amazon at the present moment in Brazil is oil development. The second one is the road, which leads to deforestation. The third one is paving some more specific issue Manaus to Porto Velho highway. So what's your thinking about this? And adaptation, now I wrote that you are too. I would like to hear something about that because adaptation is the biggest problem. for us. Because nothing will happen if we don't get it. In 2025, we're going to have a very bad situation with long-term consequences that will affect the financial sector. What can we say about adaptation to a climate that is fastly, quickly accelerating its rate of temperature? I'm sorry, I don't want to be rude. It's nothing to do personally with you, but it's exhaustion. We are exhausted. People who thought I wasn't really 92. So here again and again and again, centuries, at the same time, we see the propaganda say, how green we are getting, get us a big exhausted. Just give an example. You said something very important. It is essential to have fiscal, green fiscal policy. We have, this government have a proposal for a green tax reform, where there's nothing at all of green tax besides a very qualitative issue that helps the judicial courts to use the argument that the tax system has now outsourced to it's a very qualitative. There's no single instrument in this field. And again, we're still subsidizing the worst activities that we can. I'm sorry for too emphatic, but it's exhaustion.
I'm still a master student in political economy and international political economy. I would go a bit in the same way as Cadu, specific for a lot, but for all the table. If I was thinking about fiscal, you talked about fiscal constraints, and since we're already pushing an agenda, industrial policy agenda, and it's getting more known, but as I would say, if we could push the fiscal agenda, because the fiscal constraint, it shouldn't be seen as something natural. It's an instrument that the Global South has to put beyond what we're doing, and in my vision, nothing goes without saying something about this. And the other thing, you talked about cooperation, and I would say something which Cascolato and the professors here say about the innovation system, is the integrated knowledge that goes beyond cooperation. It's actually going to property and knowledge, and that is a big battle where you should have the accumulated knowledge that some institutions already have in Brazil and in other countries, and spread this knowledge between institutions. I think that goes beyond cooperation, and I would like to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, Orlando and Luis Fernando, sorry, there are many questions, so please be something synthetic. Orlando?
Okay. I have a question for Professor Guevara. You mentioned that you were facing lawsuits, something like that, because of trying to dodge the fiscal rule. And I don't mean to make you uncomfortable with this question. I just think that it's very relevant to touch reality, given the case of notable cases of lawfare and using the justice system to attack those that are making economic programs, economic policies in Latin American countries. So perhaps you can talk a little bit more about your personal experience, if you want, as a case for us to understand what we are actually facing when we try to do things that have a reaction from those that oppose the sort of economic programs that we like to push forward. And a very, very, very small question for Professor Carvalho. It's a question I've been asking, so sorry for revealing this to the audience, that who are our allies when we want to push for sort of agenda that you are pushing for?
First to Diego Guevara, the picture that you analyzed here about Colombia, macroeconomic issues, seems to be very similar to the problems of Brazil. Fiscal gain, the reaction of the market, and so difficult to implement policy. In any case, in the case of Brazil, the Minister of Finance of the current government proposed some initiative to resolve sustainability, finance sustainability, particularly the issue of green bonds, that is the international financial market, or the climate fund, and also the initiative of the taxonomy. So the taxonomy that is being implemented in the. So my question is how about the current Colombian government? What are the initiatives from the government in order to try to improve this sort of the green finance? And for Laura, it's just I'd like to hear you more about your assessment, your view about the Plano de Transformação Ecológica that is being implemented. That's all.
Any questions? I don't know. Let's try 2-3 minutes each.
Sure.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to go ahead. So let me take on the de-risking. So for those of you that have joined us in different moments, perhaps the summary take that I have from the different presentations in the last 2 days is as follows. We understand by theory that capital would prefer short-term returns, right? And on top of that, we have the premise that private capital, not public one, private capital will only be mobilized if the risk-return profiles in some specific sectors, it is improved so that they can engage. And that is that they would like for us to provide assurances that those short-term returns will be accessible. So that's the premise. On the second hand, we have this hypothesis that solution of climate requires really scale-up finance, right? And we presume that what is missing is what bridges the access to that finance to an already existing large portfolio of projects to be invested, right? We learned earlier today from our colleague from the Central American Bank that there is no such portfolio. In most of the cases, it is not. And when countries discuss industrial policy, it's a blank check, right? There is not really a programmatic approach behind it to really understand whether the achievement of this will be measured, will be achieved, and will be monitored, right? It's just a hope that by setting up some policies, some specific targets will be deployed. So that this bridge, it is affected because of the project-by-project approach, right? Many of the financial institutions, like the Green Climate Fund, follows a project approach, not a programmatic one. And that project approach needs to associate the risk-return profile that is needed by private investors. So my point has been the following. We should be careful not to fall on the fallacy of the de-risking of private investment. Whenever it's possible and can happen, it should be there. But we should also work on de-risking instruments for public investments, right? Because otherwise, the de-risking of the private investment, the cost is shared back to the government. Just to give you an example, in the Galapagos debt case, the guarantee covering political risks was paid by the government to the Inter-American Development Bank. So we pay for the enabler, right? The private sector needed to pay a different risk to the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. That political risk insurance provided by Development Finance Corporation is only provided to the private sector. It's not available for governments. So what if the governments would like to do some investment? Where are the products that we need for the policy sector to do it? So it's not a question whether we need it or not. The risk is necessary. But we also need to provide a balanced approach so that they can be offered to the public. Second, there are not necessarily only de-risking in the sector like agriculture, which is already very risky because of land tenure issues and others beyond the conflicts over risk and so on. How can we improve it so that the farmers can access to the finance? If you ask any bank, there are no first loss, there are no risk insurance covering the risk of the farmer. it's very costly for them to access. So if we are making this happen to be profitable and attractive for large private investors, the case for making the same for small farmers should be there. So it's just that. I mean, the risking is there. It's a technical issue we need to manage. Hopefully there will be instruments, and hopefully we can provide alternatives for those that need it the most to also have access to those. That's my whole reading. I'm coming back to the gentleman. I was here in Rio for the Rio Plus 20 negotiations. At the time I was a negotiator. And I do agree sometimes tracking it is lost, but it's somehow interconnected to the climate discussions because of the SDGs. I cannot comment on the oil reserve thing. What I can tell you is the following. It has been proven by literature that 30% of the oil reserves should remain on the ground. And currently the financial incentives, even de-risking instruments, are there for new exploration to take place and for new oil extraction camps to take place. So if we are concerned about subsidizing deforestation, definitely we need to remove those. But at the larger level, the larger institutional investors, they are the ones that should remove the incentives for continuing to explore and extract the oil.
Yeah, I want to continue with some ideas, and probably just to keep with the idea of the oil exploration, just for example, in the large scale, what is happening with the oil and gas investment that is not coming to Colombia because of our message? They are moving to Guyana. All the drills, all the infrastructure. So basically, there are no incentives for financial capital that is connected for oil and gas sector. So basically, what I can do as a country, I'm losing fiscal revenue, and they're moving to other region of South America, to my neighborhood, Guyana, that they try to attract more investment. So, and then we are facing a higher fiscal deficit and a real cash flow problem for our social policy. So I think that this is part of the debate regarding the risking. I think that that you already said everything, but most of the experience that when you are in finance minister and you go to an international meeting, immediately all Credit Suisse guys, Rothschild, all the international financial guys who are structuring these products, they're trying to sell that to you. And the main purpose is not the nature goods itself. It's how you can get some commission and additional revenue. So it's how all the energy transition is also financialized. And this was the reason why I ended my presentation. We need to work together in the transition to new financial architecture at the same time that we talk about the fair transition. So I think that it's something that we need to go hand to hand. We can see that in the Laura's last slide, how the poor countries, I think it's amazing, 70% higher cost for poor countries. Even for us, probably Colombia is not 17, but probably some like 7, 8. So it's important. Regarding Rolando, right? Your question. I mean, two brief experience in my three meetings. For example, in the tax reform that we did with the company at the beginning of the government, we were able to pass a specific tax for oil sector. But 6 months later, passed in the parliament, but 6 months later, we lost this tax on royalties for oil companies in the Constitutional Court, because this tax for the Constitutional Court was something like, I don't remember the specific word, but it's something like confiscatory tax. Immediately, the Constitutional Court said, sorry, and this is a third part of our tax reform. So basically, we lost almost a leg of the tax reform that we did in the constitutional discussion, in the lawyers, international lobby, and we have a huge legal dispute with the Constitutional Court, but the lawyers from the oil and gas sector were, of course, powerful than us. Regarding the fiscal rule, and a brief story about that. The last year, when I was in the finance ministry, it was really hard to achieve the fiscal rule for 2024. So we create something called a once-time transaction, PV, transacciones única vez, to try to justify something that we can try to remove from the fiscal balance and achieve the fiscal rule, not because I am a fan of the fiscal rule, I do jokes with my friends that when you're in the government, you have to put your custom of neoliberal guy. But it's not because I love that, it's because it's a rule, and if you don't keep the rules, then you have legal problems. And basically, because we create this TTV, transacción única vez, we are facing a legal problem because the opposition say, hey guys, you try to cheat, you try to create some traps to, to say that you pass the fiscal rule. So, I mean, it's something that happened when probably it's a contradiction, and probably the most, and I have a lot of discussions with my former colleagues in the university, because now most of them say, Diego, you are neoliberal, or do that, come on. I went to the real life and I tried to take some risks to try to do something, and you have to be pragmatic at that point. Otherwise, you can stay in academia, keep criticizing the rest of your life, and it's amazing. If you have a permanent position in the academia, it's amazing to do that. But I think that if you have the chance, you have to work the challenge, because if we are hetero, it's not just a scholar, it's a political academic project. So I think that it's important to mention that. And the question to Luis, yeah, we started to issue green bonds in Colombia like 10 years ago. The problem is that probably the taxonomy that is connected with these green bonds is really constrained. So probably it's really small. It is less than 1 point of the GDP, because the requirements that they need for the projects are not easy to achieve in the country. So probably I think that, but it's so, and I think that this is the problem with the green bonds, and this is the idea, and probably this is why a lot of people is not talking more anymore just green bond, more about concessional finance that is more with specific projects, because otherwise it's really wide, and then you face a lot of constraints.
Okay, I'll try to be concise as well. First, on why I think if my presentation was about how to reduce carbon emissions and how to adapt to climate impacts, Cadu, 100% of it should be about deforestation and what can be done in terms of, I don't think, in terms of emissions, energy, and even manufacturing is irrelevant, and land use is, as you know, really the issue. I think what I try to do is instead, which is a completely different story, is how can the climate transition elsewhere, which is mostly about energy, namely Europe and the US and so on, how can it benefit us in terms of our industrial development? And so I'm not looking, and this is an important disclaimer, I'm not looking at strategies of development for Brazil that reduce the most the level of emissions in Brazil. I'm looking at how the climate transition elsewhere can benefit Brazil in terms of its industrial strategy and development strategy. And it is a very different question to start with. I would say there is one connection, or two maybe, on what you're proposing. And so if I had to say what is the biggest economic opportunity in the climate, in the mitigation strategy of Brazil, that's definitely the bioeconomy piece and the bioeconomy sector, right? And that's where, let's say, the mitigation strategy for Brazil with the economic development strategy for Brazil meet. That's the sweet spot. And that's why everyone's talking about it. A lot of people are thinking about it in different ways, and it's not where I focused, but I think it is one of the green sectors. It's broader than that because it's many sectors. It's also
financial too. There's a lot of
financially, it's nature-based solutions and it's really, there's a lot of attention to it, but I think it's not by chance. It's because this is where, at the same time, you have the largest sources of emissions and you have strong economic gains possible. I completely agree with you on the fiscal subsidies to sectors that are actually damaging and again, if this was a talk about how to make Brazil more sustainable, I think what you're pointing to would be the most important aspects. I try to focus on how climate elsewhere, the issues that other countries are doing can benefit us, and it's different, and I think not necessarily incompatible, but different. Adaptation, I think again there is a sweet spot there possible, because I would say that investments in adaptation can also be very, very impactful economically and for development and for job creation and many other things. So again, here, adaptation, I do think is a strategy. I had a bullet point somewhere on resilient infrastructure and adaptation as an opportunity, as an economic opportunity. The use of public procurement in infrastructure projects for also engaging local production and local knowledge, I think, is also another area that could be that could connect both goals. On knowledge accumulation and the corporation side and the knowledge side, yes, and I think even at COP30 and this kind of negotiations that we see, I would say that it's focused too much. I'm not saying it's not important, that finance is not important. And I understand that countries, particularly countries in Africa that face external constraints, focus on development assistance and aid and getting as much as possible of public finances and public resources from rich countries towards the transition. But in terms of actual industrial development and technological development and structural transformation, I would say that the issue of technology transfer and intellectual property is as relevant, at the very least as relevant as that of finance. And I don't think it has taken the importance and the prominence in climate negotiations as it should. Breaking patterns of green tech and pushing for technology transfers for some of these technologies, I would say is as important as finance, because it brings more than just the financing for importing. Really, the finance that the countries want right now and push for is financing for what? Like, if suppose we had very generous European countries, much more than we currently do, because they all focus on private capital mobilization these days. But suppose they actually had public resources for the transition. What would this be for? For importing German technologies, mostly and Chinese technologies. That's what the money is being used for. It's not for localizing knowledge, technologies, and production. It's not, right? And patents, breaking patents, technological transfers, instead, they allow for structural transformation. And so when we talk about just transition and we only think about who pays for the cost of importing foreign technology, then we're not really talking about just transition, right? We're talking about, I don't know, like rich handling. I don't really see, I mean, it's really rich handling. It's like I give you money for you to buy my things, right? That's what Germany does in this negotiation. So I think that's why maybe my frame was around these issues, but I think the knowledge sharing piece is core. And even the risk in an innovation, I think, creates an incentive for countries to come together on innovation hubs and think about regional initiatives, things that could also diversify more the risk in innovation policy, as opposed to just national. On fiscal rules that need to be moved, of course they need to be moved. I think it's different in each country, and I think as Brazilian economists, when I started to work, I see Charles Abuga here, like when I started to work on Africa, I could say Argentina, but also Africa, mainly Africa, like then you start seeing that the fiscal conversation is a completely different one. One thing is if you issue bonds in your domestic currency, that's Brazil, you have a huge interest rate, that's a problem, it's a problem distributionally, it's not just a problem fiscally, it's a problem, you can believe in MMT and think there is no constraint, but in the sense, still, I think there is a problem if you transfer as much to bondholders because you pay 15% interest rate. So there is at the very least a distribution problem that we face in this current macroeconomics of this country. But even if you don't think there is a true constraint here, many countries that don't have even the capital markets developed to issue bonds in the currency, that's a completely different scenario, and that's most countries that we're talking about here. And so I do think there are true fiscal constraints. Maybe there are, in essence, balance of payments constraints, but there are still constraints that countries can't just move by being creative. It's not as easy, right? Finally, on who are our allies? I like that question. It depends on what, right? But I think on these green sectors, one thing that is puzzling me is that the IRA, when Biden did it, had this view, this political economy view, which presumed that by creating these sectors and these fiscal incentives in certain states that were Republican states, that this would somehow make the policy lock-in, right? That you would create some lock-in. And so you would create these coalitions, they would have private sector, and this would create its own kind of lobbying around them, and this would make the policy survive. And so this was the assumption which had to do with making the actual sectors the allies, right? It was the workers, but also the businesses that they thought they were creating a thing and that this would lock the policy in. I think now we know that it didn't work to lock the policy in. Congress in the US has just passed the complete elimination of all the green subsidies that have been created for these sectors, including Republican states, right? So it didn't work. And I think it's a question because I don't think it's a stupid assumption. Like I would tend to think that maybe allies would be those potential beneficiaries and trying to create coalitions that included, because one thing with industrial policy that those who study this usually argue is that the problem of industrial policy is because the sectors that actually manage to influence industrial policy are only the existing ones, usually the ones that actually have less chances to prosper, right? Like you'll see the car industry that has been at a coma since 1980 here in Brazil and still managed to get subsidies, new policies, and so on. This is the problem. So if you think about coalitions that can create green coalitions around the sectors that are not yet there, that would be the ideal. But I think the reality is proving a little bit more challenging and it's still hard to see. I would say that when I talked about Petrobras and its role in this country, and here I'll get into another contentious issue that maybe Cadu will leave the room even more unhappy with what I'm saying. So the oil sector, I think, the fact that we always start the conversation about climate with the losers, like the fact that we always frame the conversation as, hey, you guys are doing something that you should stop doing. So it's the agribusiness, it's the oil, it's everything that needs to be out of the economic structure, of the illegal deforestation. Like we start the conversation always with the losers, and then think about how to get rid of that, how to create incentives around getting rid of that. And this, I think, in the global south makes it really harder to advance this agenda because there's always trade-offs. It's always going to be framed as trade-offs. It's always going to be feeding backlashes from anti-environmentalists who come, and we know them very well, who come into the debate to say, hey, these climate folks, these environmentalists, these are all foreign NGOs who don't have interest in our economy, who don't care about our urgent socio-economic developmental needs, right? That's what we have, that's the reality, that's what makes you exhausted, right? But the fact is that if you start with the winning side, which is maybe the climate transition is actually an opportunity, let's try to go to the opportunity and bring in sectors around the opportunity, then we're also perceived as not addressing the real problem. But from the political economy side, I would still think it's better to start with the opportunity and even think about how do we have some of those that are on the losing side take part in the opportunity? How can Petrobras be a beneficiary on the transition? How, by diversifying its activities away from oil towards other sectors like SAF? How can the agribusiness be a beneficiary of the transition by using biofertilizers and stop depending on Ukrainian, Russian fertilizers? I think that's where you start bringing people on our side. And maybe we have different perspectives, but I still feel this is a way that is more promising in this context here and several developing country contexts than what we have. I'll stop here. I would love to answer planos de transformação ecológica, but I know I extended too much my time. But I don't like the planos de transformação ecológica.
Sorry, I will have to be unfair with my right-wing questions, so maybe we can go for a coffee. Yeah, 10, 15 minutes.
Just one final comment. I think somebody mentioned how can we work more closely with young scholars so that perhaps the practice in government can be scrutinized or learned. So happy to talk to you in the coffee about that, perhaps with ideas. There are a few of us that have gone through government working on this space, which faces different challenges from the traditional ones, and perhaps there's something that we can work on.
Yeah, please give some preference on the people who sit right here with the question in the coffee break.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the debate. So thank you. We are coming back in 15 minutes for the last session.
That's